Phelps is Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Nottingham. He joins us from there. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, it's well known that many of these far-right groups have been around in the United States for many years, but they've always been sort of under the shadows, so to speak. How do you explain what we're seeing now?
Well, what we're seeing is something that has been clear to many observers, which is that since the election of Donald Trump, this part of the right, this supposed white nationalist, but really white supremacist right, has been emboldened, recruiting, active, and we've seen an uptick in episodes of white racist violence, too, against immigrants, against people of color. And so this is just becoming an international news sensation as a result of the events in Charlottesville, but is something that has been evident to many observers this year.
And when you hear terms like alt-right, is that just a kind of rebranding of what are basically white supremacist groups? Just something more palatable, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, in an ironic and strange way, the racist right has taken over some of the colorations of multiculturalism. And so in order to legitimate themselves, of course, white supremacy and white racism are discredited and unpopular with the American public and with the global public. But if you can say, I'm not a racist, I'm just for white pride, I'm for white identity, I'm for white nationalism, and you use terms that can be, more palatable, and yet your agenda is the same. Your agenda is an assertion of white power, and you're in a society in which white people are privileged, and a society which has a history of white supremacy. And so it's clear that this supposed white identitarian politics is really just a cover for white supremacy, absolutely.
You mentioned Donald Trump there and how many of these groups have been emboldened by his election as president, and there's been a lot of criticism of his reaction to it, the many sides comment. And as we've also been saying, many Republicans who support Trump on a number of issues have been condemning this explicitly, but he hasn't. The longer that goes on, how long do you think he will be able to stick to that position?
He has a coalition, a political coalition, that includes people who are on the right, conservative, and favor things like tax cuts and smaller government and so forth, but also includes people who voted for him because of all of his bigoted rhetoric. He talked about Mexicans as rapists. He talked about building a wall. He's talked about Islam in very broad sweep terms. And this is, he doesn't have a discriminating, a mind that understands the importance of fine distinctions, and he doesn't have a rhetoric that's inclusive of all Americans and that is humanitarian. And so he's been playing to that base, and he's trying to avoid alienating that base while at the same time condemning violence in this case. But the idea that many sides were responsible when clearly it was a cluster of white racist organizations trying to defend a statue of a Confederate general who fought for the cause of the South, which was the cause of slavery, and his inability to understand this moment as crucial and to articulate what president of all Americans should be articulating in such a moment is indicative of a serious problem at the core of his political project. And I think it's one of the reasons why he's so deeply unpopular, the most unpopular president in the history of modern polling.
And I have to ask you, as an American, on a personal level, are you worried about the direction that your country is taking right now?
I'm both worried and certain that in the long run, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice bends toward equality. every time we've seen an episode of this kind of racist violence, it's only emboldened the cause of social justice. So, for example, you'll remember that the Confederate flag a few years ago was the occasion of a racist episode. And since then, more and more of these historic racist symbols, like the statue of Robert E. Lee, are being removed from public places. It just happened, for example, in New Orleans, Louisiana, that they decided to remove their Confederate symbols. And so racist violence often backfires. Of course, it's abhorrent. Of course, we all wish it hadn't happened, that somebody had driven a car into a crowd of peaceful protesters and killed an innocent bystander. But the very fact that that brings to the surface the nature of racism, which is itself violent, leads people to understand that we've got to get beyond it. So it's a long struggle, and it's a struggle with a lot of disheartening episodes along the way, but I'm confident that America will live up to its ideals, and that in time the Trump administration will look like an aberration.
Good to speak with you. Christopher Phelps joining us there from Nottingham. Thank you.
Thank you.